The American people knew what they were getting into when they elected Donald Trump in 2024. Trump had described himself as the tariff man. President Trump himself has insisted that he needs to have the power to use these tariffs in order to be able to conduct the kind of diplomacy that he wants to conduct with foreign countries. If it's been going on for 50 years, can it really be said to be an emergency? And if not, then is the president imposing these tariffs on a specious ground? Keep in mind, by the way, the reason we have the president in the first place, the reason why the framers created the office of the presidency, was in large part to have possibly the biggest Supreme Court decision so far of Donald Trump's second term is coming up in the near future. So this week, we began to have hearings in the Supreme Court about Donald Trump's power to impose tariffs unilaterally. This is something that scandalizes many critics of the president's economic policy, because, of course, taxes are meant to be the purview of Congress. The Constitution says only Congress shall have the power to tax. And yet tariffs are indeed a kind of tax, and President Trump is now imposing tariffs on a wide variety of countries. And in fact, he's doing it of his own authority. Now, the legislation that he's invoking in order to impose tariffs is called IEEP. This is the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, and it was passed during the Jimmy Carter years as a replacement for the old Trading with the Enemies Act, which had been in place really since World War II. This is a piece of legislation that Congress crafted in order to make sure that presidents can respond to foreign emergencies with a variety of economic tools at their disposal. Now, IEEP actually gives the president all power that goes all the way up to basically breaking off trade relations entirely with a foreign country or with any number of foreign countries. So the president can impose sanctions. The president can simply, forbid economic exchanges altogether from happening between the United States and a foreign country. There are some exceptions. There was an amendment made in the 1980s which says that transfers of information between the United States and other countries can't be affected by presidential authority under IEEP. But in general, if the president says that an emergency calls for suspending trade with a foreign country, he has the power to use that authority under the law to call off the trade. Now, the president is arguing that if he has power that goes that far, then he necessarily has any power that is less than that. So if he has the power under this law, which he does, and it's explicitly written into the IEEP legislation, if he has the power to be able to suspend trade, if he has the power to regulate trade, then it follows that he also has the power to impose tariffs. You could even construe tariffs as being almost a kind of sanctions, or as something that's trying to regulate trade, but not quite to the full extent of suspending trade altogether. The legislation also says that it's the president who gets to decide when an emergency is occurring, and the president gets to, there's no real constraint on how the president, is describing an emergency, on what he can consider an emergency. It's a power that is left very much to his discretion, although he has to renew it periodically, and Congress has the power to review what the president is doing in pursuit of solving whatever emergency problem has developed. Now, critics of the president say that, first of all, we are not in an emergency. They say that the president's two grounds for saying that there is, in fact, an emergency that requires the imposition of tariffs on a wide number of countries are false grounds. First of all, the president has said that we have a trade deficit, which is now a national security and economic emergency for the country. And second, the president has also said that the fentanyl crisis and the arrival into our country of drugs that are made elsewhere is a grave danger to America and is also an emergency. The critics say that we can't claim that the trade deficit is an emergency because it's something we've had for about 50 years now. Really, ever since the early 1970s, America has consistently run trade deficits with the rest of the world and with most individual foreign countries. If it's been going on for 50 years, can it really be said to be an emergency? And if not, then is the president imposing these tariffs on a specious ground? More fundamentally, the critics also say that while the president may have tremendous powers under IEEP, those powers can't be construed to include the power to impose tariffs because that's a fundamental unconstitutional claim of the power to impose taxes. And the Constitution is quite clear that taxes have to originate with the legislative branch, particularly with the House of Representatives. This is something, by the way, that in principle goes all the way back to our British tradition. In Britain, too, it is one of the fundamental principles of the free constitution under which Britain lives that taxes have to originate with Parliament. They cannot originate with the king. There have been wars fought over that question in Britain, and similarly, it is of fundamental importance to America and to our idea of a free constitution. Hi, I'm Dan McCarthy, the editor of Modern Age, and if you've enjoyed this podcast, please hit the like button and also share this podcast with your friends and with anyone who you think would benefit from a finer understanding of conservative thought, looking not only at today's issues, but also at the deeper questions behind the headlines, going to the very philosophical roots of the conflicts we see between left and right, and between America and our opponents in the world. If you enjoy the Modern Age podcast, please be sure to check us out also on the internet. We have the website www.modernAgeJournal.com, where you can find new content every weekday, not only original articles, but also great pieces drawn from the archives of the Modern Age print journal and from the most recent issue of Modern Age in print. You can find us in print every 3 months. Modern Age has been consistently going since 1957, when it was founded by the great Russell Kirk, the author of The Conservative Mind. And Modern Age is the premier conservative journal for philosophical thought. So what is the argument in favor of what the president is doing? What is the argument to counter his critics and to say that, in fact, it is totally appropriate that the president is setting tariff rates on his own and is using this in pursuit of America's interests? Well, keep in mind that when you have two branches of government agreeing, it's very unlikely that the Supreme Court is going to want to interpose itself and say that both of the other branches are wrong, both the legislature and the executive. So Congress, gave careful thought in the 1970s to its IEEP legislation, to giving the president these tremendous emergency economic powers. And again, IEEP is actually more of a limitation on presidential powers than the legislation that had been in place before this, which was the Trading with the Enemy Act, which gave presidents an enormous amount of authority over trade relations. IEEP, as drastic as it is, as powerful as it is, nevertheless is more limited than the old Trading with the Enemies Act. Keep in mind, by the way, that the reason we have the president in the first place, the reason why the framers created the office of the presidency, was in large part to have an official who, first of all, can conduct foreign policy under a single voice, with a single, face to America's foreign policy being presented to the entire world, a single policy, a single direction being set, and for the president to be able to address emergencies that might come up in the course, especially of foreign affairs, but even for domestic affairs as well. It is a basic principle even of John Locke's philosophy, which is, of course, the root of much American thinking. It's the root of certainly much American liberal thinking about constitutional powers. Even John Locke, in his second treatise of government, says that the executive branch should have a prerogative power which enables it to address emergencies. When Congress creates legislation that specifies what the president can and can't do in an emergency that he declares, it is in fact limiting the prerogative power that is naturally part of the executive branch. That's part not only of the executive as imagined by John Locke in the 17th century, but also that's inherently part of the executive as the framers of our own Constitution understood it as well. So this is a case of the executive branch and the legislative branch working together to take a power which everyone acknowledges the president has and to limit it and make sure that it's being applied correctly. Now, the Supreme Court is unlikely, I think, to step in and say that both Congress and the president are getting it wrong, and that the president does not, in fact, have the authority under IEEP and under his overall prerogative powers to take the actions that he's taking. The president does have to be able to respond to emergencies, and the president does have to be able to present a united face for the country in foreign policy. And that includes foreign policy in the largest possible frame. So we're not just talking about matters of war, we're not just talking about diplomacy that might have, involve peace treaties and other, specific, either declarations of war or treaties that are meant to make sure that we don't have a war, the president has to be able to speak for the country when it comes to economic negotiations with foreign countries as well. That's a part of the president's overall foreign policy responsibilities, and it's also a component actually of grand strategy, that if the president is going to be able to set a foreign policy for the United States, he's going to have to do it in ways that affect economics as well as questions of military strength. Because, of course, economics is a major component, and American industrial strength and American resilience in the case of war, all of these are factors that involve America's strength vis-a-vis the rest of the world, and our ability not only to have a coherent policy in the case of military conflict, but also our ability to have a policy that is united and that's going to avoid conflicts in the first place. Congress, of course, has the power to actually declare war, but it's the president who is responsible for representing America in diplomacy and for setting the overall grand strategy, which should be avoiding military conflicts whenever possible. And that means using economic means as well as the intimidation factor that comes with our military strength in order to be in a strong negotiating position with other countries for diplomacy across the board, whether it's diplomacy involving military matters or economic questions. The president, by the way, President Trump himself, has insisted that he needs to have the power to use these tariffs in order to be able to conduct the kind of diplomacy that he wants to conduct with foreign countries. And he's been very successful. He's created new trade agreements and new deals, new alliances, basically, with other countries, new kinds of friends, and new even partnerships with countries that may be reluctant to accept American authority. Trump has been able to use this economic leverage that he has, thanks to the tariffs, to get other countries to make agreements, to make deals that are beneficial for America as a whole. So it's a vital part of the president's foreign policy work to have these powers. And Congress, again, has actually given the president these powers. They've given him such a wide swath of authority under IEEP that he could do things that are far more drastic than simply having tariffs. He could actually suspend trade relations with other countries. He could impose punitive sanctions on other countries. And in general, it is a principle of law and a principle of justice and simply of logic that if you have a greater power, then a lesser power is encompassed within the greater power. And tariffs are indeed a lesser power than the going as far as cutting off trade altogether or imposing enormous punitive sanctions, which the president can do at his discretion. Now, there are a couple of things the Supreme Court might object to here. They might say that the president is taking too much power based on what IEEP says, but I think that's unlikely to be the case because basically, as I've noted, Congress has written legislation that is very broadly construed and that gives the president a wide swath of power. Now, in domestic affairs, the Supreme Court, especially its more conservative members, doesn't like vaguely worded legislation that gives presidents too much arbitrary authority to do as they please. But in foreign policy, the courts are much more deferential when it comes to presidential power. They don't think that courts should be micromanaging American foreign policy or the president's powers with respect to the rest of the world. And I think the court is going to be even more reluctant to micromanage these powers if Congress itself has already specified limitations in IEEP. And as I said, IEEP is actually more limited than the legislation that had been in place before. And all of this congressional legislation, whether it's IEEP or the earlier Trading with the Enemies Act, all of this is in fact a codification and a limitation on the inherent prerogative powers that the executive branch possesses. So I think the Supreme Court is likely to be rather deferential to both Congress and the executive when it comes to the authority the president has under IEEP. But then there's the question of whether IEEP itself is constitutional and whether this is something that the Supreme Court will reject and throw out. And I think that's very unlikely, precisely because if the Supreme Court throws out IEEP, that doesn't resolve the problem. It actually just leaves the president with more vaguely described powers under prerogative and under his authority, in the executive branch and in the inherent powers of the presidency. And then you would have even more litigation trying to define what those powers are. Either Congress would have to step in and create new legislation to codify and limit those powers, or there would be ongoing battles between the three branches of government to say what those powers are. And of course, even if Congress does codify what the president's powers are with respect to foreign trade, that would only create more opportunities to bring further cases for the Supreme Court to get involved in. This would basically involve the Supreme Court in an endless series of litigation about the president's powers with respect to foreign policy as it involves trade. I think the Supreme Court is very unlikely to want to get involved in that. The Supreme Court instead will trust the executive and Congress to be responsible for describing exactly what the president can and cannot do when it comes to the trade component of foreign policy. And keep in mind that there is, of course, a political remedy for any kinds of abuses that a president might engage in as part of his powers under IEEP. If the American people are upset at the way the president is using the powers that have been granted to him by Congress, they can always elect a new Congress, which can then change the law. Or the existing Congress, under popular pressure, could also change the law. Or if Congress itself thinks that the president is going too far, it can create a amendment to the law or simply a new law, which is going to say explicitly that the president cannot use his powers granted to him under emergency economic measures in foreign policy in order to impose tariffs. I don't think Congress right now is going to do that, and I don't think the American people are crying out for that. I don't think even the Democrats necessarily would want to restrict presidential power in this way, precisely because these powers may be things that Democratic presidents will need to use in the future, just as President Trump is using them right now. The American people knew what they were getting into when they elected Donald Trump in 2024. Trump had described himself as the tariff man. He made it very clear that he would use his authority as president to impose new tariffs on countries all around the world. They might even be very steep tariffs, precisely because President Trump sees it as an emergency that we have let the trade deficit get out of hand and that this has resulted in the hollowing out of American industrial capacity and America's industrial workforce. And this hollowing out of our capacity and our workforce is something that is indeed a national security threat. It's something that means we have difficulty creating enough steel to create ships. We have difficulty having enough shipbuilding capacity to, fight another war on the scale of the Second World War. China is now actually building more ships than we are. This is all a problem that has come about as a result of decades of trade deficits and decades of relying on other countries for manufacturing, while we Americans continue to create a lot of high-end manufacturing, but nowhere near as much as we have been doing up until 1970 or so. The president is trying to restructure the global economy in a way that not only favors Americans economically, but that also puts America in a more advantageous position in the long run in foreign policy and national security concerns. This is very much something that presidents are elected to do. This is very much something that the office of the president was created by our founding fathers in order to give America this kind of direction and vision, which otherwise would be lacking, because Congress doesn't really have the singularity of vision to be able to conduct foreign policy in a minute way or to be able to construct a grand strategy. These are areas that presidents alone are able and competent to address. Now, Congress has done the right thing by creating legislation which specifies just how far the president can go and specifying certain limits, that the president can't declare an emergency without any kind of temporal limitation. He has to renew it. He has to go to Congress and explain what the emergency is. These are proper and appropriate checks on presidential power that Congress has imposed. I don't think the Supreme Court is going to want to impose additional checks on its own authority, which are then going to set back and defy both Congress and the executive branch, and that will create not only enormous difficulties for American trade negotiations with the rest of the world, but that will also create potential dangers for America in foreign policy and make it extremely difficult for any president to construct an effective grand strategy. Basically, the grand strategy that had been pursued since the 1970s and earlier was beginning as a Cold War grand strategy. That was true under Jimmy Carter when IEEP was first passed. It was true under Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush thereafter. But of course, the Cold War then ended, and in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, you had presidents like Bill Clinton and George W. Bush who continued to pursue a grand policy of global liberalism, including global trade liberalism. And the hope back then was that if we have a regime of free trade, even countries like communist China will ultimately be forced to liberalize internally and become freer internally as a result of their engagement with the world economic system, with free trade, and with the rising wealth that comes with that. The idea was that this would have a liberalizing effect on the entire world, and that this would actually basically achieve our foreign policy goals for us. It would mean that communist China would no longer be a potential danger to the United States, because the effect of free trade and global liberalism would be to lead China itself to become more liberal and freer and less dangerous. But of course, what we've actually seen over the last 25 plus years has been the opposite, that free trade allowed China to become industrially much stronger. It allowed China to become much richer. And China has used that industrial strength and that riches not to become freer, but in fact to become more formidable militarily, and more formidable not only as a regional power, but as a global power as well. And this is basically the opposite of what the strategy of free trade was meant to accomplish. Instead, we have put ourselves in a much worse position strategically vis-a-vis China as a result of the trade strategy that had been pursued for the last 25 or 35 years. Donald Trump is now in a position of trying to reorient all of this, to break us away from the failed strategy which has actually weakened America militarily and that has strengthened an opponent like China, and instead to have not only a new approach for America, but a new global economic system that is going to create more industrial strength for America and for our allies, and that's going to have some effect in checking the growth of China and checking the concentration of economic and military industrial power in China, in the hands of a communist state. If Trump is going to do this, if any president is going to be able to pursue this reorientation of grand strategy, including grand economic strategy, the president has to have considerable powers to do it. And you have to take this moment as a kind of emergency, not only because of fentanyl, but because of the critical mass that has accrued to our trade deficits. And if we're not going to make the change now, when will we ever make it? This is a crisis point, it's an emergency, it's a turning point, and the American people have given their own imprimatur and approval to what President Trump is doing based on the results of the 2024 election. So I think the Supreme Court, even though it's hearing these arguments and there is a case being made that says, well, the president can't possibly use tariffs because those would be taxes and the president isn't supposed to have tax power. In fact, this is not a taxation of Americans. This is a taxation on foreign goods that is part of a foreign policy strategy, and that foreign policy strategy is addressing basically a critical situation that has accrued to become an emergency. The Congress has limited presidential powers, but it has limited them in a way that still leaves the president an enormous amount of discretion to regulate foreign trade, including cutting off foreign trade, including imposing sanctions, and implicitly imposing tariffs. I therefore think the Supreme Court is ultimately going to rule in favor of the president. It's going to uphold IEEP. It's ruling not only in favor of the president, but also in favor of Congress having given the president this power, and in favor of American voters as the ultimate determinant and the ultimate determiners of how our strategy should be directed in economics and in foreign affairs more broadly. It is the American voters who get the say on electing the president and who get the say on electing Congress and on how Congress is then going to limit or expand presidential power. The Supreme Court, which is unelected, would not see itself, I think, as being the appropriate venue for deciding on emergency powers, meddling in foreign affairs, and trying to overrule not only the president and the Congress, but also the voters who elected both of those branches.